Welcome to Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 51, being recorded on October 12, 2022. We got about 45, 50 people in the chat, and we started out talking about anarchism in the chat today. That was just sort of, we do some, we play a little music, we have a little chat before we actually start recording for the people who are listening on YouTube after the fact. There is, 20 minutes of hanging out in the beginning, and sometimes that gives a segue into what the show should be about. Anyway, what we're going to do today is obviously some COVID articles, because we pretty much always do that, and I have a few interesting COVID tidbits as everybody moves indoors, closes windows, and starts spreading COVID like it's their job. That's the phase of the pandemic that we're in now. Really, I think, disturbing things on the horizon. Anyway, we're going to cover a few things related to that, but I had this article left over about worker ownership, and it was a debate from like back in the 80s about, is worker ownership good for the labor movement or isn't it? And I think we can all agree the labor movement has been in decline, just this is a fact, since about 1960, somewhere around there. Of course, the CIO, which was one of the more mainstream, more radical labor unions, not as radical as, say, the Wobblies or something like that, but did use industrial unionism, which is a different method of organizing. It's not by trade, it's by industry. So this lends itself to more effective strikes and things like that. Well, unfortunately, in the late 1940s, after World War II, after using the left in the Popular Front to achieve some of their aims, shutting down rival imperialists, the Allied powers decided to turn on the socialist, communist, anarchist, even, slightly less predictable sock them elements that were in that Popular Front, and they decided to stamp us out. This was the McCarthyism period, or the second Red Scare. First Red Scare was back around World War I. So what happened after that was basically radicals were stripped out of every arena of civil society, libraries, community organizations, and labor unions. So the CIO was so impacted by McCarthyism in the late 40s and early 50s that it got decimated. Membership was greatly reduced. And also Taft-Hartley, the Taft-Hartley Act, this was a massive anti-labor law that was brought into effect at that time, effectively outlawed industrial unionism. Like, if there was an effective method of labor actions, industrial action, pretty much Taft-Hartley outlawed it, and it massively tilted the scale as far as class struggle in the labor union arena. Tilted it massively towards employers in a way that Western Europe did not even remotely have anything close to that. And that's pretty much where we are. So in 1955, CIO got swallowed up by AFL, became AFL-CIO. They used to be separate. AFL was always one of the more conservative, even reactionary, pro-capitalist trade unions. They were fighting for, quote, a fair day's wage. Definitely not the end of capitalism, but just preserve capitalism, but, pay the, quote, deserving workers. Definitely elements of racism, sexism, etc. in who was being calculated as deserving. But, just get some better wages for some of the more deserving workers, and class collaboration, that was pretty much the order of the day, not really anti-capitalist, etc. And so the labor union then went into decline after this, and I don't think that it's a coincidence that it went into decline after this. You kick out every suspected communist, quote unquote, and it's going to impact the labor movement, and that's what happened. So cut to the 80s, things got really bad. Reagan really stepped it up. People point to Reagan's busting of the air traffic controllers strike as kind of a, watershed moment as far as, that they weren't playing around and that they were going to really be tough on labor. And unfortunately, the concessionist labor brass, the labor union bosses, kind of went with it. And they're like, all right, well, we'll play ball. They kind of accepted the framing of, like, quote, labor unions have served their purpose, but they've gone too far. Whether they did so explicitly or not, they went along with that narrative and didn't put up the fight that needed to be put up. So I guess this brings us to our article because that was 82. The title of the article, Worker Ownership, Buying Control or Selling Out. This is from the Multinational Monitor, November 30, 1985. So it's basically a debate, and there's an introduction here that's in italics, and then there's basically the pro and the con position in this debate. The Case Against Worker Ownership by Mike Slott, and then Worker Ownership, A Tactic for Labor by Dan Swinney. So we'll hear from both sides. But one of the things we were talking about with anarchism is like how, like many other people in the U.S. left, I heard of Marxism before I heard of anarcho-communism or really anything very detailed related to anarchism. So, I got introduced to Marxism and read some introductory things, the manifesto, some history of the Russian Revolution and things like that. And I thought it made a lot of sense, but I was a lot younger at the time, and the mantra was like, communism is dead. I thought it made sense, but, due to personal reasons and everything else, I kind of moved on from it. When I got back into politics, I bounced around from this and that and the other. Hence, for some time, I considered anarcho-communism. And, I think I encountered a lot of the arguments for it that many people make, such as like, well, it's not, quote, state communism, and it's so therefore all of the Cold War rhetoric that was used against the Soviet Union doesn't apply because it's a different kind of communism and this and that. I was like, all right, I'll hear this out because, like I said, I'd been introduced to Marxism and read a few things, but I didn't go deeply enough into the reading to be really firmly anchored before I moved on. Eventually I did come back around to it, and part of the reason why, obviously we're here doing this channel and doing this live stream today. But part of the reason why I did come back around to it was, during that time of looking into like, the anarcho-communist thing and everything like that, I was involved in a worker cooperative. And I've talked about this in some of the Understanding Richard Wolff playlist videos that we've done at S4A. And it soon became apparent to me, as I was just telling the chat, in the co-op, as it was kind of the consensus among the worker owners at the co-op, was when we were looking to bring more people on into it. It was very hard to find people, actually, who had been obviously socialized in the United States school system, in the United States workforce and labor market, to think about work and cooperation and competition in particular ways. And a lot of people just didn't have the skills of communication and being able to like participate in group decision processes and things like that. It was just not really going very smoothly. We thought that the co-op would kind of help create more socialists, if you will. What we found is that actually our enterprise was not enough to overcome the socialization that all of these workers who we were considering to become part of the cooperative, it wasn't enough to overcome the socialization that they had had basically since birth. Like in kindergarten, in the early grades, you get taught about cooperation and things like that, but really a lot of the messages skew towards competition after a while. And that's pretty much the basis of everything. And we did find that the people who tended to fare better in the co-op and actually become worker owners and productive members who really could fully participate in the, everything that was involved in doing the co-op, they were people with some, at least, prior experience with left philosophy, politics, activism. In other words, people who had already kind of broken away from the mainstream thinking about what work is and things like that. And they were really looking for a place to apply in practice in their day-to-day life some of the things. They were looking for an experiment to join. A lot more of the people who came in raw from like working at the mall or something like that, it didn't work out, and they actually brought more of that culture in, which was really sharply at odds. So in other words, for me, after doing this for less than a year, it became very apparent to me that you can't just have co-ops. They're not strong enough to withstand the forces of capitalism, basically. And the case for revolutionary abolition of capitalism became obvious, because unless you actually take over society and tear down everything that's here and replace it with proletarian institutions, different style of education and things like that, that actually trains people to know how to cooperate by the time they get to a workplace like that, it's just not going to work, or it's going to be like significantly more difficult. And I think that you see this. Somebody brought up the example of the Mondragon Corporation, which, is the largest cooperative in the world, and they're diverse as far as they're involved in different industries and things like that. But they do engage in many, standard corporate practices like outsourcing and, using labor in like South America. They're based in Spain and stuff like that. And they have to do this. So there's really no substitute, in other words. And this is kind of what brought me back around to like, I just need to get anchored back into Marxism because all these other things don't really work. Is like, I even tried, participating in that sort of ANCOM dream of the worker co-op. And that's not to say that worker co-ops can't do some good, or that they can't be somewhat liberating for the people involved who already have some background that allow them to understand and participate and everything like that. They can, I'd probably prefer working in one to not working in one, under capitalism. But that said, I do not think that they're ever going to be possible as like an avenue out of capitalism in and of themselves without more of a Marxist-Leninist, approach to sort of, society-wide revolution, because it's just not enough. So Mondragon, they do some things radically differently, and then capitalism also drags them down to where they can't do that much. This is part of the reason why, even if you have a national revolution, and even if you take a pause to sort of build yourself up internally, as the Soviet Union did after fighting World War I and the Civil War, you need eventually that world revolution wave to keep sweeping the globe. Otherwise, and you need it to keep taking out capitalism, in other words. Because if capitalism, as has happened since, the 80s or so, gains the upper ground and starts to push back on you, it's not long before it starts dragging down other projects. People look at China, and even the people who defend China as socialist and all that kind of stuff, they'll usually say, well, look, they've had to make all these compromises in order to survive in this world. And it's like, well, at some point, though, isn't capitalism just simply winning because they're having to reduce the content of their elements of socialism, many of which are still left over, but they're having to replace many elements with capitalist elements. The private sector in certain areas of their economy is like enormous. Like urban employment, if you compare it from 95 to today, it's like the overwhelming majority of urban employment is private sector. So I get it, the party's still in control, this and that, but for how long? Anyway, my point is that when you try to do this on a small institutional level, you can't compete with the bigger society. And even when an entire country goes socialist, has a proletarian revolution, it can't survive on its own for long without that wave of revolution spreading. So we really need that. And, I think any countries that are still, I know there's people who argue that no country is actually existing socialism anymore, or ever was, whatever. But the idea is that once your country goes socialist, if you succeed at having a revolution and deposing the bourgeoisie, you absolutely need that to keep spreading. Otherwise, it's going to jeopardize your own capacity to like hang on to that. Anyway, that would be the point. But let's read through the article. I'm sure that the chat is going furiously at this point with, a lot of food for thought here. So let's read the article. We'll come back to it. So, and one more piece of background information on this was Reagan, Ronald Reagan, in 87. So he used to be a big labor activist, actually. He was involved in, I think, like the Actors Guild, and he was like a big believer back in the day in the labor movement. And then he got turned, basically. I forget the name of the guy who did it, but there was like a particular right-wing mentor that got Reagan's ear, turned him into like a hardcore free market Republican fascist, and started the neoliberal thing really in earnest. Um, but anyway, Reagan, I think, still retains some element of that. And he started this, I think it was called the Project for Economic Justice. He gave a speech on it in 1987 that you can find. I mentioned this before. But basically, he was positing the U.S. government promoting worker ownership as a tactic to get workers less interested in Marxist-Leninist type socialist revolution, socialist politics. So in other words, he saw and promoted worker ownership as a way to get workers more invested in capitalism with like the illusion or the sensation or the feeling of ownership while still leaving the bourgeoisie basically in power. So Lenin, talks, just to distinguish two concepts for people who are new to this. There was talk of trade union consciousness versus revolutionary consciousness, or like, communist, socialist consciousness. So the idea is that you can have trade union consciousness, which is becoming aware that the boss calls all the shots and that the workers need to organize on the shop floor for better conditions, better pay, basically for more power, which having the power can get you what you want, which is probably going to start with things like conditions and pay and things like that. And eventually, if you took more power far enough, you could have your union, especially if it was well organized across the entire industry, you could have the workers actually directing production more, which is, of course, what the bourgeoisie does not want. And it really ultimately would threaten their power. But anyway, trade union consciousness, as far as the awareness of you need to organize for better conditions, this was basically economism and one of the early struggles that the Bolsheviks, fought against. And then also, you can have just that, but what you need to add to it eventually is the need or recognition of the need for taking political power. It's not enough to just win power on the shop floor. You also need to, abolish the bourgeois state and create a proletarian state in its place. This is the key thing, that state power is involved. Otherwise, you're leaving the bourgeoisie in power. It's just not going to work out for you. All right, anyway, with all of this in mind, let's get into it. So here's the intro. A lively and sometimes bitter debate is raging within the labor movement over what worker ownership actually means for U.S. workers, now and in the long run. At times, labor has been supportive of workers owning equity in their companies, especially in cases where plant closings of still profitable firms threaten to throw entire communities out of work. Buyouts offered workers not only jobs, but a voice in managing their companies. Just to pause for a second, this is coming back again because a lot of the boomer generation, and this is not to slam boomers, but it's just literally to reference their age bracket. A lot of boomer-owned small and medium businesses, well, more medium businesses, a lot of them thought that their family would want to, their kids or whatever would want to take over the business when they got to retirement age, which has been happening for the past decade. In most cases, the family, their kids or whatever, did not want to take the business over. So what happens is the businesses often get sold to giant capital firms who, maybe they're vulture capitalists and they strip it down for parts. In any case, it's not going to be the same, and probably a lot of people who worked at that job, they're going to get laid off. So co-ops kind of came back recently as a way for workers to hang on to their jobs when the owner hit, 65, 70 years old and wanted to retire. But do the workers really control it? Well, there's different things. I mean, you can have a worker co-op with actual horizontal control where all the workers vote on everything. And maybe at the other end of the spectrum, you can have ESOPs, like employee stock ownership, where in a lot of those cases, the workers do not even own the majority of the company. And then it kind of just makes them complicit in the business without any of the benefits, where, their retirement is tied to the stock of the company. And it kind of ropes them into aligning with management or the owner's interests. They nominally own it, but maybe not really. Probably we'll get into that here. Anyway, continuing. U.S. business was more skeptical of employee ownership, warming up employee stock ownership plans, we were just talking about ESOPs, only after substantial tax incentives had been offered by the federal government. Under stock ownership plans, workers receive part of their wages or benefit in the form of stock. Though workers, quote, own a share of the company, they usually have little or no real control. The labor movement makes a clear distinction between ESOPs and buyout ESOPs. Offer workers, is this sentence? They lost me. The labor movement makes a clear distinction between ESOPs and buyouts. ESOPs offer workers stock in return for wage and benefit concessions, while buyouts, I get it. That hyphen is supposed to be bigger. It should actually, okay, never mind. They make a clear distinction between ESOPs and buyouts. ESOPs offer workers stock in return for wage and benefit concessions. Buyouts offer ownership and eventual control. Okay. We're also talking about punctuation in the chat. There's a good example. That's like a hyphenated word. That should be space, dash, dash, space. All right, anyway. Many labor activists fear that in both ESOPs and buyouts, workers will be trading wages, benefits, security, and union solidarity for stock in an enterprise that they will not really control. For others within the labor movement, however, worker ownership is seen as one of the few new and innovative ideas around. Well, it's not actually really new at all. There have been worker co-ops since the 1800s. What are you talking about? Worker ownership, proponents argue, has the power to spur industrial reorganization and to create a broader social movement for economic reform. Well, this was written in 85. I would say it has not done so at this point. Worker ownership has been embraced by people on both ends of the political spectrum. President Ronald Reagan and Senator Edward Kennedy have both supported the concept. Now, what do Reagan and Kennedy both have in common? They want no real fundamental change to capitalism. All right. In 1984, the new tax law offered important incentives for employee participation in firms. Within management circles, the incentives to form ESOPs were already substantial. Tax breaks, increased productivity, more harmonious worker-management relations, and less capital expenditures. According to the National Center for Employee Ownership, firms where employees hold at least partial ownership have twice the productive growth rate, are 150% more profitable, and, in the case of majority employee-owned companies, create 3 times as many new jobs as enterprises where workers have no stake in the company. Tax breaks, coupled with increased productivity, have enticed thousands of firms to establish ESOPs. Less than 10 years ago, there were 300 ESOPs in existence. Today, there are more than 7,000. Let me add, so that is proven as far as the creating more jobs and things. Like I said, I'd probably rather prefer working at a co-op than not. There are usually a lot of benefits. There's also problems, but there can be benefits. The workers tend to be more flexible in allowing each other better conditions and things like that. So, there are definitely benefits. But again, when we're talking about pathways towards capitalism, pathways out of capitalism towards socialism, I wonder if that was a Freudian slip. I do think in many ways co-ops are just a pathway back towards capitalism. It doesn't really take you out. For labor, the incentives are much less tangible than the incentives for management, but in the long run, they could have a more profound impact on the future of both labor unions and workers, proponents argue. In the struggle to save a plant from closing, both the union and the community can be united into a broader social movement that can better understand and challenge corporate power. So again, pausing there, this is what I was talking about. Where my skepticism comes in here is I'm not sure your average American, and I'm not trying to just America bash because I would love it if this was the case, but speaking realistically, this may sound cynical. I don't think it actually is. I think it's realistic. I think that a lot of people just do not want to know about this stuff. The consciousness isn't there, and when it is, it's so easily corrupted by the right wing into taking on strong elements of racism, nationalism, whatever, where you don't actually get the broader social movement piece of it. I mean, it can under certain circumstances, but I think it's so vulnerable in the U.S. because class consciousness is so low The, deeply embedded history of racism at every level of society is so prevalent, so prominent, that I'm still kind of the mind of like, you need to almost rebuild society and re-socialize people from the ground up. I guess this is me making the case that the U.S. is almost just too far gone. But I do think it's going to take something really, really radical to change people's consciousness to where people can even want to comprehend something like this. Very, very few people do. Obviously, we've got to work towards that, and that's where educational efforts, such as I'm trying to do and other channels are trying to do, come in. But trying to be realistic about where we're at, it is very difficult, and there's a lot of things stacked against us. We just have to acknowledge that as we set out. Otherwise, you can wind up going really hard at it for a year and then winding up like really, really disappointed. In the following debate, Mike Slott, field organizer in the Philadelphia area for the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, that's UE, they're kind of known as one of the more democratic and more radical unions, so he's making the case against worker ownership. And Dan Swinney, director of the Midwest Center for Labor Research, look at the pros and cons of worker ownership in combating plant closings and corporate flight. Corporate flight is, of course, things like, moving the company out of the United States into some other company where they can pay workers lower wages. So, the case against worker ownership by Mike Slott. American employers may not have a solution to the long-term crisis of the world economy, but they have developed a coherent strategy to weaken the labor movement. Through a combination of concessions bargaining, plant shutdowns, and shifting capital, corporations have succeeded in intimidating unions and dividing workers. As a result, the labor movement grows weaker, and workers lose what little protection they now have for their standard of living and basic rights. Unions will become a marginal force in society unless the labor movement develops a viable strategy for responding to these employer attacks. Time out. This was 37 years ago. Have unions become a marginal force in society? Yes. I hate to say it, and maybe there's a slight uptick currently, and we want to fan those flames and encourage it to grow. But what happened over the last 4 decades? Yes, unions became a marginal force in society. They were on the way down in '85, and they kept going down. Obviously, globalization in the 90s, after destruction of the USSR, everything, that hastened it. But yes, certainly unions have continued their decline. The current program and policies of most sections of the trade union leadership are clearly inadequate. The labor movement urgently needs a new strategy. Pausing again, Eugene Debs, when founding or co-founding the IWW back in 1905, we have the speeches up on the channel, gave a number of speeches about how trade unionism was already inadequate. And then here, 80 years later, industrial unionism still pushed into the background, partly by law, but also partly by people going along with that injustice. Clearly, worker ownership merits serious consideration as an alternative to the current strategy of union leaders. But a strategy should be supported only if it has the overall effect of strengthening the labor movement, meaning increasing the power, unity, and self-confidence of rank-and-file workers. A strategy which strengthens one group of workers while hurting the rest can only be harmful to labor. So pausing there, what does that mean? How do you, in the labor movement, strengthen one group of workers while hurting the rest? So there's things like union scabbing, like unions being used to break other union strikes. Again, looking back at why industrial unionism was brought in like 1905 in the United States, it was exactly to get around stuff like that. And here we see in 1985 still, puttering around, and the stuff hasn't still been implemented at that point. That's where slogans like an injury to one is an injury to all come from. It comes from the method of organizing. If you organize by industry, not by trade, that's actually effective, and from a material basis puts everybody in the same boat, where an injury to one is an injury to all, and you can actually mobilize people in an effective way against capital. Continuing. Many people support worker ownership not as a means of strengthening labor, but as a way to foster a labor management cooperation, class collaboration, and give workers a greater stake in the capitalist system so that they will be more productive and more concerned about the company's profitability. The potential for worker ownership is severely limited by the structure of capitalist economies. All of the vital sectors of the economy are already owned and controlled by the capitalist class. In the absence of a mass political movement, they can block any attempt by workers to make significant economic inroads on their power. Workers simply lack the financial resources to challenge employer domination of the commanding heights, highest levels of the economy. Given this lack of resources, worker ownership will be limited to the crumbs of the economy, either to certain labor-intensive industries, which is the traditional co-op sector, or to financially troubled companies. In either context, worker-owned companies face serious problems. Many are bound to fail economically due to a lack of capital and/or poor market conditions. The ones that survive may be taken over by investors looking for a profitable place to put their money. A final scenario is one in which worker ownership survives, but as a non-threatening, marginal part of the economy. Can I just say, I would like to applaud that. This guy is on the right track from my perspective. So what's he saying? He's saying that capitalists are going to hang on to any parts of the economy that are actually profitable and consequential, and what is going to be allowed to become worker cooperatives. Labor-intensive industries, not capital-intensive industries, which are the traditional co-op sector, or financially troubled companies that basically capitalists have decided, this business is too risky, here, do you workers want it? And then, the crumbs of the economy, in other words. And then, if the workers do take over a company and they make it profitable, then the capitalists are going to come around and try to buy it from them, just like they try to buy any profitable company, because that's what they're interested in. Profits without doing work, profits by just buying shit. And so, again, none of this really confronts the fact that the bourgeoisie controls industry. And that's what we're, as socialists, trying to address and confront, to abolish capitalism, not just deal around the edges in these super marginal areas, because it's not going to be consequential. As far as, the dictatorship of capital, we're trying to challenge that, and does this give us an avenue to that? Evidence suggests no. Worker ownership is not only economically unfeasible, its overall impact on the labor movement is negative. The precarious positions of employee-owned companies in the economy requires workers to put most of their effort into two basic tasks: raising the capital to buy the company and start it up, and two, competing successfully against other businesses. The whole orientation of workers is shifted from militant confrontation with their employers to survival in the marketplace. So it's basically giving workers at best a petty bourgeois consciousness. And it's taking people away from class struggle. It's taking the workers away from class struggle. And it's making them into small business owners. So, yeah. Is this good for the idea of ending capitalism? Or is it actually giving them kind of a material stake in its survival? When worker ownership consists of isolated employee-owned companies, as it does in this country, this approach does even worse damage to unions. One of the basic components of trade unionism is the idea that workers achieve strength through unity, that solidarity is the basis upon which unions can fight effectively for their demands. In the current economic and political context, worker ownership strikes at the heart of union solidarity. Workers who gain ownership of a company tend, over a period of time, to identify less with workers employed by other companies than with the company they now own. Worker ownership is also divisive because it undermines union standards. Most employee buyouts have occurred as part of a concessions deal. In order to save jobs and prevent a plant closing, workers agreed a major wage and benefit reduction and a weakening of traditional work rules. In exchange, workers buy out the owners and gain employee ownership. This seems like a perfectly reasonable deal, concessions for ownership. Yet, while the concessions save jobs in the short run, they hurt workers and the rest of the labor movement. Lower wages and benefits at the employee-owned company put pressure on other employers, or give them the excuse to seek wage reductions at their companies. Workers end up competing with each other to offer employers the lowest labor costs. Industry-wide contracts aim to prevent such competition by creating uniform wages, benefits, and working conditions. Unfortunately, uniform standards have already been seriously eroded in several industries because of concessions bargaining union leaders. That should maybe be hyphenated. Concessions bargaining union leaders. When worker ownership is achieved in exchange for concessions, it further erodes industry standards. The pitfalls of worker ownership are evident when one examines several employee-owned businesses which were recently established in the United States. Advocates of worker ownership have sometimes pointed to these companies as examples of the potential of worker ownership. In reality, they show that worker ownership is not a viable strategy for the labor movement. Worker ownership is primarily used in this country not as a means of saving workers' jobs, but as a management ploy to increase profits. In the vast majority of the estimated 6,000 companies which have some degree of employee ownership, management has initiated ESOPs to improve employee motivation and gain certain tax advantages. Typically, workers only own a small percentage of the company's stock and have no control over the company's policies. Workers have more significant ownership and control in some companies. Lost my place. Although the extent of workplace democracy varies widely. Several ESOPs, including those at Weirton Steel and Hyatt Clark Industries, HCI, give workers majority or full ownership, but severely limit their ability to vote their stock shares and control management. The employee buyout at Weirton Steel was promoted by the previous owner, National Steel. For a number of reasons, the conglomerate wanted to unload the Weirton plant and opted for employee ownership when it couldn't find a corporate buyer. Obviously their first choice. Desperate to save their jobs, the workers agreed to a 20% wage and benefit reduction in return for gaining ownership of the plant. Beyond the formal ownership of the plant, however, little has changed. Management retains control of the board of directors and the company's daily operations. Workers can't even vote their own shares. The structure of the ESOP and a 6-year labor contract which prohibits strikes and wage increases ensure management control in the years ahead. Furthermore, by agreeing to such major wage and benefit cutbacks, the workers have set a precedent for additional wage concessions in the steel industry. The bosses can now point to Weirton's labor costs in the next 6 years as the, quote, competitive rate for all employers. Hyatt Clark Industries, HCI, a tapered bearings plant in Clark, New Jersey, has an ESOP similar to Weirton's. The HCI ESOP was shaped to a large extent by General Motors, the former owner of the plant, and the banks who loaned the money for the buyout. In a letter distributed to HCI employees in April 1984, Alan Lowenstein, chairperson of the board of directors, noted that, quote, the business and financial leaders who were in a position to decide whether the company, i.e. the employees, could purchase the plant, insisted that the company be controlled by an independent board of directors as a condition of the purchase of the plant, unquote. HCI workers, represented by UAW Local 736, now have 3 people out of 13 on the board. They will not gain equal representation until 1991. Despite the undemocratic ESOP, worker morale was high when the ESOP was initiated in October 1981. But in the last year, tensions between management and the workers has grown considerably. The demand for HCP's product, that should be HCI, right? Tapered bearings is declining as auto manufacturers switch from rear to front-wheel drive cars. Management has responded to the company's shaky economic prospects with demands for greater productivity and sacrifices by the workers. So rather than changing what they're making, they're just trying to exist in a dying industry harder. The UAW is caught between management's push for more production and the workers' growing dissatisfaction. Contract negotiations in the fall of 1984 reflected the high level of worker discontent and General Motors' dominant influence. GM demanded that the union agree to a no-strike guarantee and threatened to cancel its purchases of the company's bearings if an agreement was not reached on the issue. Since GM purchases nearly 90% of HCI's output, Local 736 and HCI management worked feverishly to come up with an agreement that would satisfy GM. Let's pause there for a minute. So these workers sort of, quote, became their own bosses. But then what? Then they have to focus on the customers. In this case, GM owned the company basically because if GM stopped buying from them, there goes 90% of their business. The company is gone. They would have they would have 10% of their income. I mean, that's not viable. I mean, what can you realistically lose? It's going to vary from company to company. What can you lose, 10%, 20% of your business in one shot? So they're completely held hostage there by GM because without GM's business, they don't exist. So anyway, GM's support for the buyout was motivated less by concern for the workers' jobs than its calculation that the ESOP was a way of forcing concessions onto the plant, which in turn could be used to pressure workers in other plants to make concessions. In exchange for ownership, the workers accepted a 30% reduction. Oh, a 30% reduction in wages and benefits. Holy shit. I mean, yeah, you keep your job, but at what cost? In fact, GM threatened to shut down the Fisher Body Division hardware factory in nearby Trenton, New Jersey, only 3 months after the HCI ESOP was finalized. The Trenton UAW local agreed to changes in shift assignments and job classifications to prevent the plant from closing. Of course, the HCI ESOP didn't start the concessions trend in the auto industry and cannot be seen as the basic cause of disunity in the UAW. Still, to the extent that the ESOP contributes to the dynamic of concessions, it is harmful to the labor movement. In the context of employer domination of the economy and a weak labor movement, worker ownership is not a solution to labor's problems. It diverts workers' activity into projects which will either fail economically or be co-opted by the system. Thank you. Worse, they can be an additional source of disunity for the working class already hampered by sexual, racial, and occupational divisions. At the heart of an alternative strategy to fight plant closings is the notion that the union's most effective weapon is the organized power of rank-and-file workers. In contrast to the AFL-CIO's emphasis on gaining influence with, quote, labor's friends in the political arena, i.e. Democrats, what's needed is a grassroots revitalization of the labor movement from the from the union local up to the level of the international union and the AFL-CIO. Yes, we need like a dramatic resurgence of militancy, radicalism, revolutionary anti-capitalism. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we look at stats like a majority of workers would join a union if there was one in their workplace, but it's so difficult to start unions that they're not getting started, even though there is vague support for it. Anyway, effective resistance at the local level requires the union to have an active and informed membership, which is prepared in advance to respond to the company's action. It's a sad commentary on the current state of the labor movement, the basics of democratic trade unionism, a strong shop steward system, elected and accountable leadership, education and training for members, a lively and relevant newsletter, have to be emphasized over and over again. I like this guy a lot. I'm going to read that sentence again. It's a sad commentary on the current state of the labor movement that the basics of democratic trade unionism, 1, a strong shop steward system, 2, elected and accountable leadership, 3, education and training for members, 4, a lively and relevant newsletter, have to be emphasized over and over again. But it's absolutely necessary to do so, for in the absence of an active membership, the union's response is bound to be half-hearted and ineffectual. A democratic local will be better able to respond with an array of militant tactics which put economic and political pressure on the employer. Depending on the circumstances, the local can initiate work-to-rule actions. So that's a kind of slowdown where usually work is done in a way that violates company rules or labor rules, but people just accept it and run with it. Working to rule is slowing down, working to the letter of whatever rule governs the type of work that you're doing. And really the employer can't fight it because those are the rules. They're actually, the norm is violating them. Anyway, work to rule actions, demonstrations, sit-down strikes, it's obviously where you strike but don't walk out, or any number of other responses. In addition to its own militant activities, the local needs to solicit support from other local unions and from community organizations to bring together the largest and most cohesive force opposed to layoffs and plant shutdowns. So again, commenting, when I say at the end of like every other video, join an organization, it can be a political party, a labor union, a tenants union, a community union, other community organizations. We need radicals in these organizations. We need Marxists. We need people reading Marx and Lenin and Ho Chi Minh and everybody in these organizations, because we need these militant networks. We need to undo basically the stripping out of radicals that occurred during McCarthyism, because how else are we going to have a vibrant labor movement that's militant and willing to put it on the line? Because yes, the fight for socialism, the fight for political power and abolishing capitalism and proletarian revolution, that is a thing, but it grows out of this class struggle I mean, the vanguard is the most class conscious portion of the working class. It's a relative measure, so it's always relative to the working masses in general. Who has the most class consciousness, and then what is that level of class consciousness? Weak struggle creates a weak vanguard. Why? Because class consciousness, yes, you can gain it through reading history and whatnot, but one of the things that accumulates class consciousness and sharpens class consciousness the fastest is firsthand participation in struggle, whether it's trying to form a union, whatever it is. So we need people active, and better struggle generates a better vanguard, and then a better vanguard generates a better movement and better prospects for abolishing capitalism. Right now, I mean, we're really just laying the groundwork for sort of an eventual return of this, keeping the torch from getting completely extinguished, if you will. But it's not just about joining a Marxist organization, where you can even find one, but it's also about joining other organizations for struggle, because if there's not broad struggle, you're not even going to have a vanguard. Anyway, where were we? As a result of such militant tactics and the locals' thorough research of the company's financial situation, the employer will be more likely to deal seriously with the union. So that's, social and political pressure, as well as, if the employer knows that the union, when they threaten a strike, doesn't really have community support, there won't really be like a strike fund, they'll be like, okay, have your little strike, we'll crush it easily. But if the union they know is supported by other unions, and, there's solidarity from radical networks, left networks all across the county or the city or the area, then they may be more likely to be like, okay, you have real power, people are backing you, what do you want? All right. If this can't keep the firm afloat, the local can demand that management eliminate waste and efficiency in their own ranks before they ask the workers to make sacrifices. The union can also suggest ways of improving productivity which don't worsen working conditions or weaken work rules. So this is what the capitalists always say, shared sacrifice. We got to tighten the belt, shared sacrifice. Really, they are disproportionately pushing a lot of that burden onto workers. But if you have a strong union with good support, then you're able to say, no, we're not going to swallow your loss. We do the work, you eat up the profits. We would get rid of you if we could. We can't do that yet. We're not strong enough. But what we can do is you're going to take the loss, not us. All right? It's been a long time since labor in the United States has really been strong enough to even propose something like that. We need that to be like the standard, because you want revolution? Great. You have to build up your power to that. I mean, labor is not even an effective counterpower at this point, let alone on the verge of becoming the dominant power. So we have to build up to this point, and you'll know it when we're getting there. And, we're still in the early stages, like I said. But, again, thank you for listening to this podcast and engaging in this education, because it's going to be people like you listening to this who are going to be out there actually active in the organizations that you either have recently joined or will be joining soon. But this needs to get done. Otherwise, you will never see any of these effects. It's that simple. As I like to say, socialism is history that we, the workers, write. If you don't write it, it doesn't get written. And literally, that's on you. I know we're raised in a society where we're trained to think we have no power, and our role is literally just make profit for a capitalist, go home and watch TV. But to be a socialist, to gain power as a worker, I mean, the whole thing of taking power, it's not something we're trained in. You may even be uncomfortable with it at first, but it's something we have to get used to, because that's really the name of the game here. At a later stage, assuming that the corporate concessions approach hasn't solved the problem, the local can wage a campaign for government aid to keep the plant in operation, or for conversion of the company's product line from, for example, obsolete military hardware to socially useful domestic products. Given the reluctance of government to subsidize businesses unless substantial corporate interests are at stake, like too big to fail, right? This approach requires the union to mobilize massive outside support to get the funds. United Electrical Workers, UE Local 277, which represents workers at the Morse cutting tool plant in New Bedford, Massachusetts, asked the city to use its right of eminent domain to take over the plant after Gulf and Western threatened to shut it down. Municipal and regional ownership established through eminent domain has also been proposed by the Tri-State Conference on Steel to salvage the steel industry in the Monongahela Valley. These new approaches need to be developed as part of an overall response to plant closings. See Saving Jobs, a New Use for Eminent Domain in the June 1984 Multinational Monitor. Might look up that article, actually. Just proposing something like that is like a step of taking power that I don't remember the last time I've heard that proposed. So closing out this con side of the debate, which again, people are used to these like streamer debates where just people like yelling at each other and like trying to use like mind games. An actual debate is this. Somebody says yes or pro, somebody says con or no. Then you do research and come up with evidence and try to make an argument, a persuasive argument for your case. Anyway, finally, if despite all these efforts, the plant is still going to shut down, the local should get the maximum level of health, pension, severance, and retraining benefits. While militant tactics and innovative proposals at the local level are crucial, the union's response cannot just be a local one. A union local fighting a conglomerate or a large corporation often lacks the resources to win against an adversary who can shift production to different locations or invest in other industries. An effective response to plant closings requires that all levels of the labor movement develop an alternative strategy. Furthermore, union solidarity and coordination allow labor to gain greater collective control of the economy. The solution to plant closings and unemployment lies not in making individual plants profitable through wage cuts and employee buyouts, but in changing the basic patterns of capital investment and economic power. When each level of the union movement, local, international union, federation, is part of an overall strategy, labor has the potential to exert some control over the general direction of the economy. International unions have a key role to play in an alternative strategy. They can provide assistance to locals fighting plant closings, and they can help to create a contractual framework in which plant shutdowns, when they do occur, are less painful for workers. Such a strategy would include pushing for industry-wide standards, industry-wide job security, public works projects for the unemployed, control of pensions funds and restrictions on capital investment, encouraging government aid for product conversions and to prevent plants from closing, and promoting international solidarity by resisting the attempts of multinational companies and governments to divide workers by nationality. Even though some of these are not feasible today, innovative programs to deal with plant closings can become a part of labor's agenda. Labor activists have begun to propose specific ideas for limiting employer prerogatives as part of a broader strategy to empower rank-and-file workers. It is through these admittedly exceptional efforts, and not through employee ownership ventures which play into the concessions dynamic, that the labor movement can regain its strength and become a progressive social force. So standing ovation from me for that. I thought that was very well stated, and I agree wholeheartedly as far as building up the strength of the labor movement. That is the wrong direction, and they propose some very good alternatives that would be a shot in the arm for the labor movement. Increase morale. If you got your town, which, if you were able to build up a fighting political movement in your municipal government, etc., and you used eminent domain to take over a factory, obviously there's going to be legal challenges to that and whatever, and you would need statewide and national support and on, all the things that they said. That would be, you could actually get capital where you wanted them and build off of that for some revolutionary energy. These are things you can do within capitalism. As Marxists, we do what we can with that, building up workers, parallel system of governing industry. And then when the time is right, our alternative system replaces the dominant bourgeois system. We don't even have the bare outlines of that alternative, parallel system, if you will. This is, some of the things that we need to do. And as I state all the time, fundamental task of the U.S. left is to dem-exit, build a left coalition, It can be of political parties, of all kinds of things, but it needs to be a left coalition that is not a bourgeois-controlled space where proletarian ideology is debated, discussed, spread, improved, and advanced. That's never going to happen within the Democratic Party, ever, 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 ever. So, anyway, looking at the time, so we're about an hour into this. I may not get to the COVID stuff. So if you're listening to the COVID stuff, odds are I'm going to switch to that in the next live stream, which I'll probably just do another live stream tomorrow. By the way, these live streams usually happen Wednesdays, 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, here at twitch.tv/socialism S4A. I had to think about that for a minute. I'm still getting used to saying the .tv. Anyway, before we switch to the con argument, and yeah, so I'm probably not going to get to the COVID stuff today. I think that reading the rest of this, the pro side of the argument, that'll take probably another 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll talk with the chat for a good long while. So that's probably going to close out this stream, just if anybody's here just for that. Actually, speaking of, let's just look in with the chat real quick before we do the other side of this. So, what do we have? So I'll have to take some of the, let me grab the chat for today, just so I don't lose anything that isn't directly related to this video, because I see some people posting about COVID, and I don't want to lose that. COVID or other subjects. So let's get that. Somebody says, how come no VODs? What's a VOD? We don't always react to videos in the stream. Sometimes we just read articles. All right, let me save that chat. So, good. Chat part 1. There we go. Okay. Now that we've gotten the chat, I'm going to go ahead and just continue, actually. So let's read through, and then we'll close out the video going through. So if you have a comment, you don't have to hold it till the end. Go ahead, post your comment. I will go through all of the comments that are related to this topic. And this thing always gives me the thing where the file select screen gets like hidden. All right, here we go. So now the pro argument, worker ownership, a tactic for labor by Dan Sweeney. I can do this because I probably am not going to agree with this. I'll do the whole thing in like a mocking tone. No, I mean, I'll try to give this a fair reading, but I can tell you I strongly agreed with that last one, and probably not going to agree with Dan Sweeney quite as much. But anyway, let's try to be fair and civil. A profound change has taken place in the economy, has it now? A change which requires an equally profound change in labor. In the mid-1970s, the American economy began to reflect dramatic symptoms of a period of sustained decline. The United States entered a period of sharp international competition with a real loss of American market share in most areas of production, a sharper and more intense scramble for profits, and a general lowering of the real and social wages of the American people. So there's a lot of claims there. Let's see if they get into some evidence for these. I mean, obviously, having some knowledge background on this general subject, I think some of these I can agree with. Some I would maybe contest a bit more. But yeah, I mean, it's generally true. After World War II, the United States escaped relatively unscathed, whereas many of the other large imperialist powers were bombed to hell, or, you know, were otherwise having to rebuild considerably. And the U.S. really came out on top also with the U.S. industrialized heavily as part of the World War II effort. So they not only came out unscathed as far as like damage, aside from like Pearl Harbor, but they also had all these brand new factories running at like peak capacity. So yes, by the 70s, a lot of other areas had caught up and were giving the U.S. more of a run for its money. But anyway, as a result, is what they're saying exactly the cause of what they're going to say the result is? Something to keep in mind for comments. As a result, there is increasing unemployment and attacks on union strength and organization, increasing the divisions between workers. Most important, there is a corporate willingness to discard whole industries, communities, people, and productive capacity, not because they aren't profitable, but because they aren't profitable enough. Within this deepening long-term crisis is the emergence of a political and economic vacuum in major urban and industrial areas. Companies which provided job creation and economic development in an expanding economy are now exporting capital and casting off assets in traditional industrial areas. Traditional defenders of the people's livelihood, like the civic machinery, political parties, the church, and organized labor, have been unable to fill the vacuum created by the change in corporate strategy. So commenting so far, they're talking about some of the conditions that gave rise to neoliberalism. So they're talking about the mid-1970s and some of the underlying economic costs. There's also, just sort of a governing consensus around this time, in the 1970s, late 60s. The neoliberal consensus, which was a class project by the capitalist class to basically roll back social democracy in the ways that they're describing. And it is also true that the traditional defenders of workers' rights and etc. have been unable to adapt to that strategy. So, fair so far. The question is, of course, is worker ownership the correct move to adapt to it? Labor's inability to lead effectively in this period is rooted in its training during the years following World War II. During the expanding post-war period, a social contract generally defined the role of organized labor. Capital would generally increase the real wages of labor, and labor would provide a stable workforce and keep out of the management of business. Yes and no. It depends what sort of big labor we're talking about, but there were definitely pushes for that. I think in the UAW in particular, which was part of the downfall there, was making moves towards management. Anyway, because of this social contract, again, somewhat vague framing, labor did not develop a sophisticated understanding of the companies and industries for which they worked. The debate between the left and right was frequently around more or less quantitative, with no real difference in the depth of understanding of the company, the market, or the industry. Strong relationships were not built among the various elements in the working community, the unemployed and unorganized, churches, community groups, and local government. Given this experience, the labor movement was unprepared for the depth of the current economic crisis. Unions were left without tactics or strategies. Unemployment is permanently high, deeply undermining the strength of organized labor. It's being used to break strikes and force concessions. With the cutting of social programs, many of the unemployed are hungry and desperate and willing to break ranks to replace workers on a picket line or accept substandard wages and benefits. Benefits and important contract provisions that protect seniority in the jobs that remain are perceived as unfair by women, youth, blacks, Hispanics, and other ethnic minorities who have been laid off first and have no chance of being recalled. This leaves labor in an adversarial position with its most important allies, at a time when it is under the most determined type of corporate attack. Organized labor is becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of labor. The dwindling percentage of organized versus unorganized occurred gradually during the post-war period. Now the decline is increasing, along with the decline in real wages, and labor is losing its base when it needs it most. Under current conditions, a major loss in a major battle such as steel or auto could result in a decisive and qualitative setback for organized labor. A union could be literally destroyed. So I don't even entirely disagree with all of this, but again, I don't know. It would be interesting to see them tie it to worker ownership as the solution, in other words. This is better than I thought it would be, but again, is worker ownership the solution? I would say going in, I think it is not. But anyway, this crisis requires innovation. Time out. Or it could just, involve going back and correcting some of the errors already pointed out. Union organizing efforts must have a much more sophisticated and substantial understanding of economics in order to develop effective tactics and strategy. So, this was something said, after the Russian Revolution was like, okay, we won, now we need to figure out how to do accounting and all that kind of stuff. Fair. But again, is worker ownership and the many strings that come attached to that necessarily the way to go? Well, they're going to make the case. Worker ownership is a tactic that can and should be used by unions in confronting the new realities. When the term worker ownership is used today, it can mean any of 1,000 different combinations of how a company is financed and managed. On one end of the spectrum are corporate tax and financing strategies, which are designed to neutralize worker solidarity, union strength, and militance. These programs create the illusion of profit sharing while giving workers no real role in management, no power to make critical decisions, and very little share in the profits. Okay, I mean, it sounds like you're not necessarily arguing for worker ownership, but continuing. Frequently, the only role workers have in the situation is to give concessions in wages and benefits to keep, quote, their company rolling. On the other end of the worker ownership spectrum are companies that are worker-owned, worker-managed, unionized, and a real asset to the labor movement and the community. Examples include the O&O supermarkets in Philadelphia, Franklin Forge in Michigan, Atlas Chain in Pennsylvania, and Seymour Specialty Wire in Connecticut. The examples are few, but the potential for many more exists. Within these extremes, there are hundreds of possible combinations. Workers must ask who is initiating worker ownership and why. What leverage and plan do the workers have? How is worker authority and dignity protected and promoted, and so forth. Based on an evaluation of these factors, a plan for worker ownership should be rejected or supported. Where the plan is not developed, negotiations can give it substance. Effective and aggressive negotiators with some kind of leverage, the potential to close the company down, the capacity to strike or cripple production, a strong community backing, can transform a general concept into a constructive working plan. Uninformed and passive negotiators, with or without leverage, can transform even a good situation into a scam for the workers, and despite good intentions, end up benefiting only the original owners. Worker ownership is a tactic, not a strategy. It's just like any other tactic, such as a strike, a retreat, a picket line, or a demonstration. It can be used effectively or ineffectively. Used effectively, it strengthens the union, its members, and the labor movement. So pausing here, it sounds like they just pointed out, the many possible pitfalls of going down this path, which I think it was the point of the last article that in practice, that's usually how this turns out. So just wanted to stick a note in there. Worker ownership is part of the general struggle for economic reform. Like any reform struggle, it can be consumed with narrow details. If elevated to more than what it is, it can perpetuate illusions, and it can be co-opted. These are dangers for any struggle for reform. Pursuing the option of worker ownership exhausts the marketplace limits and can serve as a springboard for effectively raising consciousness about the necessity for national change and reform. It does this by taking advantage of viable opportunities that aren't recognized or aren't profitable enough for traditional entrepreneurs. I really feel like there's a ton of overlap between these two articles so far, or these two arguments so far. It's just one is saying, and on the whole, the outcomes are not going to be good. And this one is like, well, there's potential for negative outcomes, but if we really, really, really do it right, then maybe not. That's the sense I've gotten so far. The fact remains that worker and community-owned enterprises, combined with enterprises run by traditional parties, won't meet all the needs of the American people. Worker ownership will not create full employment. On the other hand, the experience of worker ownership will train the labor movement in workplace democracy and in effective leadership and management. These skills will profoundly complement any major progressive change in the character of the U.S. economy. So, to comment again, this was one of the ideas that I went into my worker co-op experience with, and it was actually the opposite. I thought actually you really needed a much larger social effort to re-socialize people to do it. I thought that the institution itself was not merely enough to do that. Maybe in some cases it can be if you're at a very large company or something like that, where it has enough sway and enough people that it's super stable and it's can be that re-socializing force for people to learn how to cooperate and do workplace democracy. And I know that there are cases of that where people come out of it at least gaining some level of experience of like, oh wow, I've never been to a meeting where there was a vote on something related to production before. Like, yes, that can be a novel experience for people for sure. But is it going to be enough to be really transformative for the vast majority of people who've maybe spent 30 years working in traditional capitalist top-down enterprises? And I would be interested to see more research on that because I'm skeptical for sure. Anyway, so I think that's, as far as a piece of evidence in favor of this, it's possibly being overplayed here. So the precondition for the effective use of worker ownership is a detailed and full understanding of the company, its markets, and its industry. Worker ownership is not a good tactic when proposed by a company as an effort to get the workers to finance the closing of a plant which has been milked dry and will have no viable future under any owner. Proposed by a company as an effort to liquidate or neutralize the union, or the company is incapable of surviving in the workplace, or the workers are not capable of running the plant. I mean, not to be like overly sarcastic, I am still trying to be fair and approach this with an open mind, but like, congratulations, you just described like 99% of the conditions under which worker ownership is proposed in the first place. Because otherwise, a capitalist would simply want it, right? Worker ownership is a tactic to consider when, all right, let's evaluate this. When, one, there's a viable company that's being closed and could be operated profitably. Okay, and will the workers trying to buy it out or take it over be able to compete with capitalist investor offers? I mean, that's a real question there. How would they be able to do that? Now, there's still a bit left to this. Maybe they'll make the case, but I'm skeptical. Wage and benefit concessions are the only option to maintain a viable company worker ownership. I think we're missing a semicolon here. Yeah, wage and benefit concessions are the only option to maintain a viable company is situation 2. So, I mean, this happens sometimes where basically the company will say to the workers, hey, look, we're not that profitable, and you have 2 options. We can either close, or you can, take a 40% hit in your hours or something like that. Next, where were we? Lost my place again. Yeah, because that hyphen should be a semicolon. All right. Worker ownership becomes the quid pro quo in bargaining with the company as the cost for cash. Worker ownership becomes the quid pro quo in bargaining with the company as the cost for cash. A little unclear on that one. Or 4, where there is a viable company that is available for worker ownership for any reason. Okay, so, and other reasons that we can't specifically imagine and may or may not actually exist. So, how likely is it for these conditions to arise, I guess is the question. I think that is probably rare, and that's maybe one of the main arguments here. So in other words, this isn't necessarily an argument that goes against the con argument that we just read. It's just highlighting the fact that, as the con argument pointed out, the conditions under which worker ownership is not in the, quote, crumbs sector of the economy is kind of rare. Worker ownership and labor in a declining economy. Any discussion of the strategy and tactics of the working class movement must include those who don't work as well as those who do. Even for those who do work, the threat of not working, the threat of a shutdown, frequently dominates and sets the stage for the demand for concessions. This means that we must take the issue of jobs very seriously to forge unity with the unemployed. Yes, so you have to organize the unemployed. Why? They are, as Marx said, the reserve army of labor, and can always be used to break strikes. And capitalism purposely maintains a pool of unemployed workers to keep wages low for exactly that reason. That's why in socialism you have the right to a job. Capitalism can never promise the right to a job because they have to keep a bank of unemployed workers. It's part of how capitalists manage capitalism. It's just how it is. Anyway, so yeah, unemployed people have to be organized so that they don't wind up scabbing against, striking workers, etc. All right. This means By discussing the labor movement in terms of just those who are organized into unions, the unemployed are excluded as are the vast majority of those who are working, who are not unionized. The labor movement has generally failed in this challenge, because it's a class collaborationist, pro-capitalist, non-militant movement, by and large. I mean, it could be those things, and you could generate organizations within that movement that, are more radical and militant. Again, I mentioned the IWW 3 times. The IWW does try to organize unemployed workers and students and other people who are not sort of in your traditional unionized things, because that's how you actually gain class power. But anyway, the labor movement has generally failed in this challenge and still operates within the understanding of the earlier period of economic expansion. In other words, when capitalism was still more ascendant, sort of golden age of social democracy, prior to the tightening profit margins and decreased profitability as we slid through the 70s into neoliberalism. And of course, the weakened labor unions, weakened by law and other things, helped prepare the way for that because it led to decreased resistance from labor. Even within organized shops, union members are losing confidence in the capacity of unions to protect their jobs. That confidence can be sustained by leadership that has a very precise understanding of what actually causes job loss and what are legitimate options for preventing job loss. Worker ownership is a tactical option for those situations where jobs could be saved or created, and it identifies a commitment to create jobs and fill the vacuum created by traditional market forces. I mean, how different, though, is this from traditional market forces, and how long will it be able to hold its own against them? It is argued that worker ownership has been and necessarily will continue to be restricted to the crumbs of the economy, the financially troubled companies that are thrown to workers to avoid the cost of their closing. And I think the examples of things that are otherwise are very rare. Many of the efforts at worker ownership to this point have involved some of these crumbs, but this is not an inherent aspect of worker ownership. Some plants are exhausted and beyond recovery because of being completely milked or being in an industry sector that's been wiped out because of competition, changes in technology, changes in critical costs, or declines in market demand. Others close because, 1, they're profitable but not profitable enough for a parent company or private investors who can make more in the short term in other areas. 2, because again, do the investors necessarily care about the industrial infrastructure of America? It's a nice political campaign slogan, but remember, this is the 80s, Oliver Stone's Wall Street, Gordon Gekko coming out. That was vulture capitalism, where the idea was fuck the company. If we can make more money now selling it off for parts, let's do that. So that, this was the age in which this was being written. And it was kind of a shift, whereas there used to be among the, U.S. national bourgeoisie, more of this sense. I mean, obviously the bottom line is what it all comes down to in the end and what constrains it. But there used to be more of this ideology of we're upholding the structure of America and all this kind of stuff. And there were definitely changes in that as capitalists scrambled to make more money faster with less work, less overhead. Now we have, the kinds of things driving all the derivatives, these crazy, package, repackage, hashed, rehashed financial instruments, and the automated transactions that are it's like they took day trading and then turned it down using automated processes into microsecond trading, where they're doing 1,000 transactions a second, just trying to make a penny or a fraction of a penny at a time. That's the stage of capitalism that we're in now. Anyway, 2, there isn't an owner to succeed the current owner. The family interest dies, and there isn't a successor capable of taking over. 3, there is mismanagement. The company is run by those who simply can't utilize its assets. So those are scenarios where, people close, but the company is still viable. But capitalists might not be as interested in it. And, that's fair. How common is this is the question. And then again, as socialists, we want to ask the larger question, what does this do for workers' power on the whole? which that is, I mean, obviously the section is called Worker Ownership and Labor in a Declining Economy. So this author, who I apologize for, obviously being somewhat jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, insulting off the cuff. I mean, they are addressing a lot of the important topics, honestly. But I do think it's still somewhat being overstated as far as like, okay, but worker ownership, though. It sounds like by their own admission, it has a place in the labor movement, but arguably a fairly small one. So, in other words, nothing basically has changed as a result of this argument. Anyway, continuing. There's a common assumption that traditional capitalists are the most efficient and capable managers and initiators of companies. Well, maybe among capitalists, but obviously people involved in the labor movement know otherwise. If they don't do it, it can't be done. In other words, if the capitalists don't do something, then it can't be done. Obviously untrue, and yes, that is conventional thinking as taught by capitalists. If they don't want to do it, then it must not be worth doing. In a declining economy, this narrow vision of traditional market forces often comes into conflict with the long-term needs and capacity of particular firms and industry sectors. The requirement of a big return in the short run excludes the possibility of experimenting with new technology or processes that are required for the health of an industry. Under the pressure of a declining economy, many valuable and productive assets, companies, and opportunities for job creation simply fall through the cracks. And again, the bourgeoisie has, to a certain extent, simply shifted their priorities away from this. They're looking for profits increasingly from thin air. In this context, the ability and willingness to take over the management of productive capacity, including owning and operating a particular economy which is being ruined, ignored, or discarded by traditional market forces, is an important complement to the other tactics the labor movement uses in defending its interests and expanding its power. It preserves jobs, union or potential union membership, and enhances the union's reputation for leadership capacity. A major reason for the labor movement to include worker ownership in its arsenal is to strengthen its ties with the aspirations of a much broader movement that is committed to job retention and job creation. This movement includes community organizations, urban political organizations, religious organizations, unemployed organizations, and others who are responding to the reality of very high levels of unemployment, accompanied by the Reagan onslaught on the welfare state. So again, this was part of the neoliberal effort to roll back social democracy, the welfare state in the U.S., again, late 70s through the 80s up to today. Up to today. Too many T's or something. So I was going to make a comment here before we go to the last screen and then go over to the chat. And what was that comment? I need another sip here. Low glucose levels in my brain, I guess. Where were we? Oh, well, I was just going to say, as far as the declining economy, again, we would be remiss. I mean, I kind of mentioned the concept before, described the concept before. But the declining rate of profit in Marxism, this is a source of some debate and controversy, but it is basically the idea that over time, the nature of capital is such, you have a declining rate of profit. We're not going to go into the whole thing right now. So we started out with classical free market, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism back in, say, the 19th century. This was, the period of like classical liberalism and earlier, before, the modern welfare state and regulations and things came in. This was the period of social democracy, which sort of ended the sort of laissez-faire system in the 20th century. And now, at the end of the 20th century and going into the 21st century, neoliberalism. So it's neoliberalism because it's new liberalism. It's, in other words, a return to a system that is similar to that early capitalism, in that they're going for, fewer regulations and taxes and worker rights and trying to repeal all of that social democracy. It is not exactly the same. I mean, functionally for workers, there are many similarities. But there are some differences for the capitalists, because capitalism is no longer rising and expanding. It is now contracting. And as we've said, some of the strategies the capitalists have taken as far, just the state of development and consolidation of capital is very different than it was back then, prior to social democracy. So those are some of the differences between neoliberalism and sort of the original laissez-faire robber baron capitalism. In practice, you get a lot of the same outcomes, but there are some differences in the underlying capitalism. All right, continuing. The labor movement can play a critical role in leading this effort because of its closeness to production, its familiarity with all the issues, and its strategic position. It can bring into negotiations a commitment to the social obligations of production to workers and the community, a defense of worker and union interests in the organization of production, and aggressively exhausting what potential remains in a diverse market atmosphere. Well, then what, though? And I feel like this is where the pessimism of the previous article made more sense. Anyway, labor, by utilizing the tactic of worker ownership at the proper times, probably are few, can create a force for the growing number of people becoming aware of the limits of capital, and it can provide some models of creativity and broaden social vision. I agree. You oftentimes, where you do see cooperatives, they are few and far between in the United States, but where you see them, that is usually what characterizes them, broadened social vision and creativity. However, as far as making major waves within the overall capitalist market system, very much not. I mean, it's kind of and I don't mean this in a critical way, but it's kind of, a bubble that people are able to, it's a temporary autonomous zone, if you will, where people are able to create this little pocket of resistance where they're able to, they still are buying from non-co-op suppliers if they're a retailer, or otherwise, they're manufacturing something, they have to buy raw materials. So where you're in a system where 99.99999% of all the business that you're transacting is with other capitalist interests, not other cooperative interests. And so you're still making them rich and you're dancing to their tune. But like within the confines of what you're doing, yes, you're able to do some of those things. It's absolutely true. Is it enough, though, which is what I started out saying, to transform the system? I'd say absolutely not. They are good, like mutual aid societies and things. And you can find Lenin and Stalin, writing about this, that yes, co-ops can be part of workers' efforts to help each other survive during capitalism. But the idea is they can't have any real potential beyond making capitalism a little bit more survivable, a little bit more comfortable for the revolutionary proletariat as we're working up toward revolution. Lenin, of course, has a piece on cooperation, which is one of the last things that he wrote, where he was talking about, we have it on the channel, basically how, he considered the cooperativists cranks back in the day, because under capitalism, you can't really realize any of the potential or nowhere near the full potential of cooperatives. But the piece on cooperation was about how, after nationalizing the land in the Soviet Union, they were able to actually use cooperatives in a way that just wasn't like crank utopianism, basically. So, but that is kind of what it is. And again, I'd rather take that as far as having to work many days over the alternative, but it's really important for people to understand the limits of it. Particularly as people like Richard Wolff, I think, are arguing it literally as like one of the centerpieces of a revolutionary socialist strategy. And I think that that's just misleading people, revisionism to like a huge, huge degree. It's kind of, bringing a kind of like mutualism or anarchism in and kind of calling it Marxism. I think it's a real distortion. Anyway, where were we? To effectively choose the opportunities and to broadly expose how the narrowness of traditional market forces holds back our country's development while demonstrating a willingness to fill the void when it's possible can have a tremendous internal and external impact on the labor movement. I would definitely argue with the word tremendous, but if the labor movement is aggressive in encouraging people and organizations from working class communities to take advantage of opportunities for worker ownership, even if the workers aren't initially organized, it can enhance its own organizing of the unorganized. It has a greater capacity than most to provide technical assistance and orientation, as well as a national network that could service these efforts in important ways. There are national networks that promote worker cooperatives. I think that they're not radical or militant for the most part. If they are at all now, they've become so very recently. And I think a lot of it is couched in terms of sort of small business ownership and owning a piece of the American dream, and very much like not necessarily, socialist change, kind of radical social change ideas. It's thrown in there, and you can find it, but it's not necessarily the banner that it's marching under. Anyway, where were we? Despite the numerous negative examples that exist, worker ownership belongs in the toolbox of the labor movement as one option among many. Notice all the qualifications here. So, I think that the con kind of won this one out, but as one option among many to pursue its efforts to defend the interests of those who work and the unemployed. It's a tactic that in some situations meets the issues of job loss and capital flight head on. The effective use of worker ownership can strengthen labor's role among the unorganized, the unemployed, and in society in general by helping to fill the political and economic vacuum created by traditional market forces. Finally, use of this tactic will immensely broaden the scope of the labor movement. I don't know about that. Deepen its level of sophistication. Again, no, because most of the companies you're going to be managing are not very big, and I don't think it's going to take you very far beyond very sort of petty bourgeois understanding of the economy. And train it for leadership in the critically important trend towards economic reform and democracy. Again, for the reasons stated, I don't think so. Worker ownership is a concept and an option that we can no longer afford to avoid. I don't know if anybody's trying to avoid it, but just recognizing it probably has a small role. To be willing to rise to the challenge of this and other new approaches like the use of eminent domain, nationalization, well, those are very different, and popular control of investment funds will bring the labor movement into a position of prestige and strength that will exceed that of earlier periods in American history. Well, still waiting on that, obviously. But so my take on this overall is the con definitely is the stronger article in the leading one, and the other it's not entirely wrong, although I contest some parts of it, but I think that it, damns its own argument with faint praise by sort of emphasizing the limited role that this probably will play alongside many others, etc., etc. All right. So we're up into like the last 20 minutes. Let's talk to the chat and do some Q&A discussion. I'm going back to the beginning of the chat. So if you typed this an hour and a half ago, bear with. Let's see. And I'll come back to all the COVID comments tomorrow. All right. Anarchists do this weird thing where they point to successful co-ops like Mondragon to point out how good they are, but like those institutions are bourgeois, driven by capital and generalized commodity production, which have no interest in participating in an anarchist revolution. Yeah, so we were talking about this before, how a lot of the larger co-ops wind up acting in many ways. There are significant differences, and we have talked about them in previous videos, but in many ways they do behave like traditional large corporations. And again, this is where you need the expanding outward movement against capitalism if you really want any hope of these things not just being co-opted. Being just forced to participate in the overall global capitalist system. You need that global capitalist system to be in retreat. And how do you get it to be in retreat? By building worker power and so on and so on. I'm not here in Costa Rica, our second biggest national company is a co-op, but it behaves and looks more like a corporation. I think that's what you're going to find in global capitalism. You need like something like, a Communist Party of the Soviet Union, things like that are really strongly ideological, and otherwise you get sucked back into that. Again, look at what's happening in China now. You need to keep very firm control on this. You need to have a revolutionary militant outlook and keep the wave of revolution spreading across the globe. Otherwise, you will just get sucked back into capitalism. So there's just a limit to what you can functionally do otherwise. Because again, okay, you set up a co-op. Like I said, all of your suppliers, maybe your landlord, it's all going to be traditional capitalist stuff. And then So you're not going to be able to create the kind of effects that you would maybe transformative effects you'd maybe like to. Thank you for 18th Brumaire. It's so tightly packed with ideas. Yes, so that was the last audiobook, and we will have more audiobooks up by this weekend. But yeah, that is an incredibly dense work. There's a lot in there. I'll be posting some highlights from it in the community posts. I think one of the takeaways is the term lumpenproletariat often gets somewhat abused or like its meaning stretched. I think it's very clear reading the 18th Brumaire what Marx thought the lumpenproletariat was. Communists are the best labor organizers. If you kick them out, then you lose a lot. Yes. And, as far as people who think you can be some kind of Marxist without any connection to or understanding of the labor movement, no. Like, what do you actually think this is? One of the reasons I'm interested in reading Gramsci is I'm very interested in the idea of cultural hegemony because I think that's a lot of the reason why people just can't accept the idea of socialism as a possibility. Capitalism really does a mindfuck on you. Yeah, it's very hard to get people to actually think about, I mean, to think about anything difficult in the first place if they haven't personally experienced it in our culture. That is frustrating to me to no end. Um, Jason Unruh at Maoist Rebel News the other day, a few days ago, posted a video titled like "A Long But Needed Rant" or something like that, and just talking about how people will not. Well, it wasn't the overall subject of the video, but how people will not fight in the first world a lot of times. Like people just roll over for whatever the system gives them, and very rarely stand up. That's why I loved the George Floyd and BLM protests in 2020, like actually seeing some healthy rebellion and people getting out in the streets and all the vibrant conversation that was happening during that time about racist capitalism and the intertwined nature of class exploitation and racial and other kinds of oppression. That was great. And then everybody went back to work and it's been fucking crickets, like in comparison to what was going on in 2020. So, yeah, yet another reason to dem exit. We need that stuff going on all the time, not just in election years and so on. So, yeah, but that is true. Um, do you think Richard Wolff knows that he's pushing a dead end? Yeah. I did a video, there's something to the effect of like, the title was very clickbaity, but I think true in its essence that Richard Wolff is an anarchist mutualist wrecker who's out to revise Marx, like what Marxism is about. There's an old article of interview of him from like 2002 that was the basis of that. Yes, I do think he's pushing a dead end. I think that he's researched co-ops for a lot of his career, and he's trying to sell people on this idea that like, oh, you don't like statist communism or whatever, like you've bought into Cold War propaganda about the Soviet Union. Here, try this other thing. And he said himself that he thinks that there are three basic trends in the left. He doesn't state it outright, but the descriptions are very clear. Reformist SOCDEMs, Marxist-Leninists, and anarchists. And he says that he describes the anarchists as like decentralized and don't trust in the government and blah, blah, blah. He's clearly describing anarchy. Like, this is the broad left. SOCDEMs, communists, and communists and other Marxist, things very close to Marxism. I guess you could have left comms and things that are not Marxist, but, would be closest to that out of anything. And then anarchists. And he's like, and of the three, I'm mostly in the third category. Well, so yes, I do think he knows he's pushing a dead end personally. Somebody else says, I'm not sure he cares. I think he's a safe, comfortable old man, and this is the way he gets to keep his safe, comfortable old man life. Yeah, he's very wealthy. I think he makes $120,000 off of his Patreon alone. That's plus ads a year. So he's, yeah, I mean, and this is plus the pensions and the speaking fees and everything else. Um, yeah, yeah, I would agree with that comment. Very interesting on Reagan, worker ownership used almost like social democracy to pacify workers. Yes, actually, I'd say between the two, social democracy is probably the better bet. It's amazing how much capitalism just seeks to co opt and defang everything. Yeah, um, buy it. You know, it's amazing how many things are for sale for the right amount of money, including people. Like people's, uh, you know, do you really believe that capitalism needs to be ended, whether or not you are proletarian 100% of your life? You know, there's people who move back and forth a little bit between the proletariat or the petty bourgeoisie, etc. Uh, to me, being really anchored in Marxism is no matter what class I'm in, capitalism does not work, is a bad system, is harmful to people, is harmful to the planet, is harmful to everything, is unstable. Uh, Even as a capitalist, when you're benefiting from it, it turns you into a monster. It needs to go. But yeah, a lot of people can just be bought out of, proletarian status, or just proletarian subsistence woes can be softened with some bribes, and boom, there goes their ideology. That's a lot of people. Aligning worker interests with the owners is explicitly the purpose of these ESOPs. Yes. So the excess wages of the workers. What? Anyway. Yeah, capitalistic indoctrination is a massive pain in the ass here in the U.S. Yeah. Somebody says, I've never met a union worker. Um, I mean, single digits of the private sector are unionized. And a lot more of the public sector is unionized, like 35%. But yeah, I mean, especially if you've worked in like retail and food service, like very common sticky floor jobs in the United States, many of them are not unionized. So yeah, worker co-ops still have the profit motive, falling rate of profit, the need to compete, etc. Yeah, so they have some limited benefit as far as making a little bit of a safety bubble for people to be slightly more comfortable and do things a bit more their way, and maybe hang on to a plant that, or a business that the capitalists were going to close. It was too much trouble. It's not profitable enough. But again, making the case, if we're looking for transformation out of capitalism, I do not think the evidence is there that that is really the way. Um, I used to be in a union, but I think I'm in a right to work state, so not everybody at the company was in the union. Yeah, that used to not be a thing. That came in with Taft-Hartley, where you can like get benefits from the union without paying dues into it, and this is one of the ways that it's very hard to maintain a union in the United States. We've covered this in previous videos. Back a few months ago, I think back in June, we did a bunch of organizing manuals. There's like a labor studies playlist on the S4A channel. I'll be putting this in it. You can find those in the labor studies playlist. I had a roommate that worked at a co-op. It was a grocery store. He made it sound pretty good. Yeah, it can be. I mean, I've also known co-op groceries that are just consumer co-ops, and the workers really have no organization or anything. It really depends. So co-op, when you hear co-op, it doesn't always mean worker co-op. It can be consumer co-ops or other producer co-ops. There's other types of co-ops. So, a lot of grocery stores will be consumer co-ops where, it's like the prices are the same basically as anywhere else, but maybe you get a 5% discount if you're like a member owner. So at this point, I think like back in the 60s and 70s and earlier, co-ops were known sometimes as buying clubs, where basically the idea was you get 5 or 10 people together and you form a buying club so that you can buy wholesale instead of retail. That was kind of basically the idea of consumer co-ops. So retail capitalism is where you buy a product that like you're buying a commodity explicitly for resale, that's retailing, and you're marking it up. So you buy it at a low price and you sell it at a higher price. The difference is the profit. That's retail capitalism. There's also like industrial capitalism, where you are getting raw materials and you own some equipment, the means of production, and then you hire laborers, you pay workers wages, and you apply those workers' labor time to the means of production, and you make commodity for sale, probably to, I mean, I guess it could be, direct if they're a retailer also. But anyway, the idea is that the profit comes through through that process, extracting the surplus value, etc. There's also financial capitalism, where you're making profits off of charging, rent or interest, stuff like that. So anyway, consumer co-ops were a way to get around retail capitalism. Although a lot of what call themselves co-ops now, the prices are like basically the same as they are retail anyway. So I don't even know why people bother with that a lot of the time. So, this is again just the low standards, the sinking standards. We need a massive infusion of radicalism and militarism that honestly would make most people in society today deeply uncomfortable, because I felt like, especially through the 2000s, there was this massive wave of neoconservatism, if you will, that wasn't just political, it was cultural too. I think it started in the late 90s, but it was kind of just this wash of stifling conservatism fell over everything. And I think to get the kind of, there is somewhat of a resurgence of radical ideas and culture, and just people being comfortable with rocking the boat again coming back. But I do think we're coming out of a period of like pretty bad reaction. And again, or let's say starting to fight against it, My job has a union, but I can't join it because they have certain membership requirements that I don't meet yet. Well, yeah, I don't know if your case, if that's fair or not. I'm hoping you get what you need out of that. Good comment about COVID news from Florida. I'll cover that tomorrow. All right, so let's get into the current chat. That was what I saved from the halfway point. In Greece back in the 80s, Sakdem Pasok managed to deactivate most unions by turning one union against each other. So again, if you use the sort of industrial union, one big union strategy, this is how you can avoid that, because you make it structural. But as many unions have not done that, they're vulnerable to being manipulated in that way. Anyway, e.g. drivers against farmers when farmers block the roads to protest, and vice versa, or private sector employees against state sector employees. So boom, no more solidarity, and without solidarity, collapse of the labor movement. Yeah. And again, these problems were pointed out by Eugene Debs, among others, over 100 years ago. You'd think we could learn these lessons by now. But no, everybody's, just give capitalism one more chance. Just give it another chance. It'll be fine. No, we finally figured it out. We've worked out the bugs. It's stable. Oh, it crashed again. Oh, well, fuck you. You're losing your job and everything else. Oh, well. And then, people get mad. It's like, oh, no, wait, one more chance. No, we figured it out. Capitalism's stable. Oh, it crashed again. There goes your life. Yeah, we need to stop doing that. Worker ownership companies is as hard to survive in capitalism as building communism in a small country. Yeah. Yeah, it can lead to really dire shared sacrifice. I mean, you look at what DPRK went through in the mid-90s. I mean, without the USSR there to help, a much bigger economy to help support them, they went through a horrible famine. And that's the kind of thing that it's really difficult. It was why we need the wave of socialism and proletarian revolution to expand, not contract, because then when things get tough, the smaller entities have a really hard time. And there's no shame in that. It's the way it is, But yeah. Rick Wolf is on Breakthrough News pushing Nixon era price and wage freeze. To me, this sounds like a gift to the capitalists because it keeps in place the already inflated prices and prevents worker wage increases. He's really promoting wage freezes? This is crazy. Um, yeah, worse than I thought. Yeah, we need worker wage increases, which are desperately needed. Am I wrong on this is BS, or can someone help me see it? Um, I haven't seen that particular interview, but I'm not seeing it from what you've described. So it is a bit shocking, but yeah, that sounds like it is as shit as you think it is. Would a raise and price freeze hurt workers more than higher interest rates? It depends where these interest rates are going. I think we're headed for a crash. If you look at the housing market, I mean, I think we're headed for like a 2008 type crash. The housing market is fucked. I was going to do articles on it today. Maybe I'll bring that up again. But I'm not sure what the extent of the mortgage-backed financial instruments are at this point. But I mean, that was one of the causes of 2008, and again, housing is being. This is why you can't treat housing just like a commodity like this. We need to take it out of the market in that particular way. Capitalists will find a way to gamble on, make a profit off of anything that they possibly can. And housing is a basic need. It affects your need for everything else. People who are out of a stable housing situation affects everything else. It affects personal hygiene. It affects your sleep. It affects your ability to like get to a job. Literally everything is the baseline of is having stable housing. So anyway, would a raise and price freeze hurt workers? So I mean, in other words, would we want to freeze things where they are now? Is that even possible? So things are not good now. Freezing things where they are would be terrible, and also freezing wages. Um, how is this good for class struggle right now? I don't know how price freezes can help in a world where the biggest companies are transnational. Won't the companies just sell somewhere else? Yeah, that's a good question. Prices are rising way faster than wages, so I could see why capitalists would prefer, excuse me, a higher interest rate over freezing prices. Uh, yeah, and neoliberalism is very much state supported nowadays. Well, that's the thing is that there's a level of finance capitalism of merging of all of these things to where it's different. Like I was talking about, the capitalism underlying the economy today is different. Lenin was talking about it even back in the 19 teens, describing the emergence of what we would call the military industrial complex around World War One. Smedley Butler also wrote about this in War as a Racket. We have, I think Lenin talks about it in Imperialism, but also in things like, uh, I think War and Revolution, some of his shorter works as well. But yeah, how all of these things were getting conglomerated into one thing, like one entity. So yeah, it's definitely different now. And we are talking about too big to fail and things like that. It's not even just too big to fail, where if it crashed, it would bring down the rest of the economy. But also, just things that are, quote, in the national interest, like weapons or stuff like that. It's not like the weapons directly would affect the economy, but the U.S. economy runs on violence. I mean, it's not just like the price of bullets, or something like that, like affects huge swaths of the economy. But it's even more foundational. It's like the U.S., quote, economy is also the military, and without making those things, it just can't exist. It perpetuates itself through violence. As well as, I mean, it employs many people and keeps us out of the streets. So from, its point of view, it can't demilitarize. Otherwise, how would we all be employed? And again, I've said before, you would need the revolutionary, peaceful, planned, cooperative transition out of capitalism on an international scale, literally, to get the U.S. to stop being what it is. So, I guess my big questions are one, how can we ask worker cooperatives to aid a broader revolutionary movement? How do we radicalize those which already exist, or creating any new radical ones where they may be advantageous? So, again, I think that I mean, they exist there, and again, there are organizations which exist to sort of, help worker co-ops network with each other. And again, I don't think that most of the literature being put out there is very radical. So how do you radicalize them? There's not that many, to be honest. So I think general proletarian messaging, probably would have more of an impact at this point. But anyway, two, wouldn't active workers be able to achieve most of these lessons in a similar long-term people's institution through a militant union struggle? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, I think you would. I mean, the amount of people employed in the cooperative sector in the U.S. is like negligible. So, yes, yes. Or is it worth finding terms through which a militant union and militant cooperative movements should cooperate? I think that the militant union movement, even as small as it is, absolutely dwarfs the cooperative movement. So, I mean, there's overlap. You'll find people involved in unions are probably also the most interested in cooperatives. I just think we shouldn't have any illusions about the power of cooperatives. So, what do we think of Titoism? We covered that a little bit back in the Richard Wolff thing, and I read a Hoja thing about Hoja's criticisms of Yugoslavia, which was specific. I mean, we specifically did the one which was Yugoslav's self-administration, a capitalist concept. I'm probably that's probably not the exact title. I'm paraphrasing. I thought a lot of the criticisms in there were fairly valid. I mean, there's the meme of like the Yugoslav economy. Step one, get an IMF loan. Step two, get an IMF loan. I liked a lot of Hoja's criticisms. I think that they're a decent jumping off point for a critical ML look at it. I don't think it's the final word either. But I think that it's a decent, if we're talking about a debate, I read something from Tito and then I read something from Hoja on the same subject. Tito was promoting their system and Hoja was criticizing it. So I put those two pretty much back to back for that exact reason, so that listeners could listen to each and evaluate who they thought was correct about which points. We're most able to imagine socialist futures via science fiction. It enables us to step outside our subjectivity about what's possible within the current social relations of capitalism. Yes. Now, I happen to not find a lot of sci-fi very interesting. Um, so I think that is something that sci-fi does need to just some of the genre trappings of like robots in space and things like that. I just often don't like as a as far as the genre trappings. I hear sci-fi and I think stuff that is a bit dull for me. But you are right. There's a lot of interesting social messages in sci-fi, which often can be very revolutionary. Um, so yes, I agree. I mean, I agree. But I also think it's somewhat of a niche genre, although you could say that maybe the forays into, there's like a ton of dystopian young adult stuff, like from the Hunger Games on these days. So, yes, we could also say bad sci fi also has the possibility to sell dystopia, as well as good sci fi to consider, positive social change. Bigger conversation there, but yes, good comment. Wolf stated he was taught communist theory by an old Bolshevik who was friends of the family. How could he not know what he's doing? Yeah, yes, hands down. Wolf grifted for money and is out to revise Marxism and dilute it for first world radlibs. You know, I think you may have hit the nail on the head there. What do I think of Chris Small's Mick Lynch? I actually don't know Mick Lynch, but people who are starting unions go for it. We've covered the Amazon labor union a bit here. I think that they need to stay focused and keep expanding. That's what I would say. But it's obviously good. You need to organize at the large companies. So excellent effort. Mid 90s to 2008, workers were given access to hugely increased debt instead of wage rises. Yes, so this was solving the wage shortage by extending credit. So we're just talking about financial capitalism. Not only are they not paying you, but they're going to also charge you interest on the fake wages credit that they are paying you. The debt makes them more conservative and less radical. Since 2008, the wheels came off of the credit instead of wages form of capitalism. Yeah, so we plunged into austerity after that. Very unpopular. The system is still reeling. It has never really recovered from 2008. I think we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. When it drops, it will drop in a big way. What will this upcoming recession mean for the average worker? Uh, I just went out and did some errands the other day, and so many of the shelves were just looked like they had been ransacked. And of course, they haven't been ransacked, they just haven't been restocked. Um, we're already seeing, I mean, the stock market crash, that's not going to affect workers as much. It's going to affect the bourgeoisie more, um, which that's happening now. There's been already some significant stock losses. But what we're looking for is the complete meltdown like we saw in 2008. And I'm not sure exactly what's going to drive that. Like I said, there's a lot of signs of instability in the housing market. What is it going to mean for the average worker? I mean, obviously more pain. They're seeking to curtail labor's strength, which during recessions, labor's strength is cut because there's less demand for labor. So, I mean, I can't get into all the details of this now. It's a good question. Bring it up again in another stream where we have some more time because I am trying to wrap up right now. This is an end of the stream tangent on my part, but I can't stand chuds that go around projecting how communists are somehow fascists. In a way, they have the same kind of attitude about being honest with themselves as Mac from IASIP does. I'm not sure who Mac from SIP is, but well, they don't understand it. Nobody knows what the fuck it is. That's part of why we're doing so many primary sources on the channel. You know, and there are other channels doing this kind of thing too. It's nobody even knows what the fuck it is, and we need to overcome that at just like the most basic levels of education. If anyone wants a pretty good sci-fi show to check out, I'd recommend The Expanse. All right, I'll make a note of that. I have never heard of The Expanse. The Expanse. All right. Neither co-ops or unions on their own are going to get us to socialism, but at least unions are a realistic method to create dual power structures. Yeah, I mean, they can also form a basis for workers learning how to. I mean, as you gain more power in on the job, you do learn more about what's going on in the job. You don't need to actually own it to learn that, about how it's managed and about the kind of business that it's doing with other, you know, I mean, obviously businesses can have business to business transactions. They can have business to consumer transactions, whatever. If your union gains significant strength and gets involved in management, which many union contracts have have clauses that are specifically like management rights contracts to prevent that from happening. But yeah, you can do that. And of course, we live in the internet age now. It's not hard to create videos about how industries work, who are the big players within an industry. You could put together a 2-hour presentation easily, maybe even a 1-hour presentation that brings workers up to speed on how the supply chain within their industry works. In fact, people should do this. So anyway, co-ops remind me of Robert Owen's utopian societies where they just say fuck all and do their own thing, whereas unions fight the capitalists directly, building class consciousness. This is why Lenin says there's schools of class consciousness. Yes, I completely agree. And again, read, and we have it on the channel, Lenin's On Cooperation. It's from 1922, I think. So it's around there. So, yeah, I mean, and in defense of Robert Owens, this was basically a capitalist who made these little factory commune type of things to give workers a good life. This was a much earlier stage of capitalism, and capital was not nearly as consolidated and so on. It was utopian for sure, but those examples did provide a lot of fodder because they were real world experiments and you could actually analyze what worked, what didn't work, why did it work, why didn't it work. But yeah, I agree. Being in a fighting union, it will sharpen your class consciousness pretty severely. And it's not just unions. You can get involved in other, even political campaigns and things like that. Not just necessarily for representatives, but if you're in a place where there can be referendums put on the ballot, say for minimum wage or like whatever other kind of thing that could benefit workers' interests. Fighting for that and watching up close who's fighting against it can be very instructive. Very, very, very instructive. All right. Closing on these two comments here. So somebody is agreeing with that comment, and old high school buddy tried that on me. 3 weeks later, he was saying things. Oh, all he watches is Babylon Bee. Yeah, that's bad. It can turn you reactionary. Someone I knew since we were kindergartners got really into right-wing politics around 2015, and since he did, I quit talking to him around 2017. He hit me up wanting to hang. I told him I didn't want anything to do with him for being the way he is, and then he started sending me death threats. That's fucked up. So yeah, there's a limit. I think the stream died, which is weird, but I'm still recording. Anyway, on that note, I've been going too long. Maybe the internet is just telling me I need to get up. But thanks to everybody for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are about to be on the screen. There we go. I even got the names on the screen this time, unlike the last stream. Thanks to everybody there. Patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. It can be recurring. It cannot be recurring. Of course, the recurring helps me to plan this thing from month to month. Anyway, huge thanks for that support, because I would make videos even if nobody supported, but the support allows me to spend more time on it than I would be able to without that support. So that's greatly appreciated. Like I said, we're going to do another stream either Thursday or Friday or sometime, probably Thursday, to get into the COVID stuff. But thanks to everybody for dropping in live on the stream and checking it out after the fact on YouTube. We will catch you next time.